And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever more acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. What's the most difficult temptation? It's kind of a dangerous thing, I think, what we're doing today, marking the first Sunday of Lent with our penitence and worship, and then gathering to address the business of the church at our annual general meeting. This is not a combination I would prefer to work with very often, I'm being honest, especially when we consider our readings today, that these readings that cry out with the question, what tempts you? What tempts us as the church, the body of Christ? Our gospel story today highlights 3 temptations to challenge our trust in God and our trust in one another as Christ's body. We could summarize these challenges with 3 questions. Whom do you trust for your nourishment? Whom do you trust to love and care for you? Whom do you trust with your service? First, whom do you trust for your nourishment? Immediately following his baptism, Jesus is led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. And so the scene is set for the first temptation. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. We'll come back to this challenge to Jesus' identity, but it's important. It gets repeated, this question of who Jesus is as the beloved of God. For the moment, the temptation to self-sufficiency is probably enough. And Jesus responds to it by quoting Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, where Moses reminds the Israelites of God's provision in the wilderness, saying, he humbled you by letting you hunger, then by feeding you manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. One of the ways we in the church have been tempted, I think, from trusting God for our nourishment, this lure of self-sufficiency, with regard to the youngest people in our community. In former times, we opted to take young people out of the worshiping community and feed them with the bread we provided. There were good reasons for this, particularly in an era when many were questioning the meaning that we ourselves experienced in worship. The mid-20th century was marked, you all remember, by conflicting experiences and desires for worship. And it made it difficult for us to trust that God would be able, that God would make God's self known to people of a new generation through our imperfect ways. With changing circumstances, we now turn to trust in a different way, trusting God manifest in the fullness of the body of Christ, gathered together in worship. As we strive here to practice our values of compassion and inclusivity, we have created, among other things, a kind of welcome poster. It's a bit new, it got a bit delayed, and there's also individual parts of it are now on some bookmarks. So if you look in some of those books in your pews, you will find some bookmarks to remind all of us of some concrete guidelines for how we worship together in community. Resisting the temptation to take matters into our own hands, we trust God's presence through the body of Christ as we worship together in compassionate and inclusive community. Second temptation, whom do you trust to love and care for you? Now, Jesus had only just been baptized when the Spirit led him into today's wilderness. This is my Son, the beloved, a voice proclaimed from the heavens, with whom I am well pleased. It happened only moments ago, one verse ago. But, the trial of living in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, maybe Jesus will have forgotten. So for the second time, the tempter challenges Jesus' identity. If you are the Son of God, test God's love and care for you. Do something spectacular, be spectacular. Jesus isn't fooled, and we don't want to be fooled either. We know the temptation to shame is strong. No human being can actually escape it. We all experience shame at one time or another. It is universal. We can, however, learn to deal with it in better and worse ways. When we recognize we're shame triggered, we are tempted to act out of a need to test God, to test one another. Will you love me if? It is tempting indeed to demand proof. And yet we can choose instead to live and move and have our being in the truth of our being beloved children of God, declared at our baptisms, forever and always. Knowing this, trusting God's love, frees us to try new things, to fail, to learn from our mistakes, to try again. Knowing that we have nothing to prove, trusting ourselves and one another, frees us to face the next and perhaps the most insidious temptation. Third and finally, whom do you trust with your service? All these I will give you, the tempter offers Jesus, if you fall down and worship me. The temptation to idolatry, to trust in something, anything other than the God who calls us as beloved to self-giving love and service. This is a temptation that is pervasive, seductive, and insidious. In the church, we have, I think, at times mixed up in this way, loving and serving the church, the institution, and loving and serving people. This distinction became clearer for me in the last several months, particularly during our study of Brian McLaren's book, Do I Stay Christian? In a podcast, he had guest writer Chandrika Fia on, and she described a revelation, a kind of epiphany that she had about her faith, about how loving people with an ulterior motive, even conversion, isn't love. She and Brian discussed how we in the church have been trained for years, for generations, to love people for Christianity, to love people for the church, instead of just loving people. We are tempted with a desire to rule the world, to be served, instead of following Christ's call to serve the world. This year, this Lent beginning, we are seeking to make a change, a shift in this regard by unyoking, disconnecting community and social events from fundraising. It's a shift to help us deepen our practice of hospitality. We'll do it in part, there's a few parts, but one part is by retiring this basket and its little sign that says donations. Instead of asking for cash donations at social events on a kind of user pay basis, a user pay model, and spending our energy in fundraising events, we're initiating instead a community events campaign. So we're asking you to consider how much you value gathering in community beyond worship. Now, for those of you who've been around here for a while, you might think about how much you have given to the church, to St. George's, through these kinds of small cash donations, along with what you might have spent at larger fundraising events like the Christmas Fair or the Spring Fling. And we're asking you to make a donation to our community events campaign instead. This way, we have the funds and the freedom to serve one another and the world with generous hospitality. There has been a loss, partly through COVID time in our community and beyond our whole world, but the loss of a sense of common purpose and the loss of community connection that many people experienced through doing those fundraising events. This loss is often cited as significant. I heard it again this morning at 8 o'clock. We had such fun making the pies and doing all the different things to run those events. So the goal this year with this campaign is to have that fun, to initiate social and community building events that fill those needs without the fundraising component. Because with the campaign, the funding is already taken care of. So we can then place real value on eating together, enjoying one another's company without any other motive. And perhaps we could even find other concrete ways of working together as the body of Christ in this place to love and serve people beyond this community and have some fun doing it. We might be tempted to self-sufficiency, but we are called to trust God's presence and God's provision in community. We might be tempted to test God's love, but we have already been declared beloved. We might be tempted to rule, asking the world to serve us, but we are called to serve the world. And when we do that, we might just find ourselves in the company of angels.